Before we dig in, a quick thank you to the sponsors ready to grow with the Soil Sisters. Tejas Tonic is the official beverage of the Texas Soil Sisters. We especially love that the hemp for Tejas Tonic is organically farmed in the Texas Hill Country, with farms in both Dripping Springs and Lukenbach, Texas. The Soil Sisters podcast is powered by B&P Electric. Whether you're building, remodeling, installing low-voltage landscape lighting, or in need of an inspection, B&P is your Central Texas electrical contractor. Find links to our sponsors in the podcast show notes or head over to txsoilsisters.co. Windy Bar Ranch in Stonewall, Texas has been raising Angus cattle in the Texas Hill Country since 1983. Though their ancestors have been raising cattle in Gillespie County since the 1850s. Windy Bar Ranch raises award-winning beef and has continued to focus on the traits that made the Angus breed famous. Find out more about their beef at windybarbeef.com. And Windy Bar Ranch is looking for their next ranch manager to join the team this winter and continue the tradition of responsible land stewardship and stockmanship on this 150-cow pasture-to-plate regenerative Texas ranch. To learn more and apply for the ranch manager position at Windy Bar Ranch, submit your resume on the contact page at txsoilsisters.co. That's txsoilsisters.co/contact. You're listening to the Soil Sisters podcast, where we dig in on family farming and ranching, regenerative agriculture, healthy living, and planting seeds in our community. We invite you to listen, subscribe, and grow with the Soil Sisters. I'm Joanna Newting, joined by my blood, soul, and soil sister, Crystal. Welcome to the show.
Hello, sister.
Hello. I would love to give a quick intro to our very special guest in the studio today. We have the fabulous Andie Marsh. She is a soil health practitioner and science communicator dedicated to helping others restore life and functionality to their soils. Through her business, Rhizos LLC, she uses a microscope to assess the microbiome of soils and compost, enabling land stewards to address the root causes of soil health issues rather than just treating the symptoms. Amen, Andie. She specializes in the biological restoration of contexts where livestock integration and its associated benefits are impractical, including developed and urbanized soils. She holds a degree in bioenvironmental sciences from Texas A&M University and is a certified lab technician through Dr. Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web program. You can find Andie writing about soil health and her relationship with land in the modern world on her Substack, Soil is Sexy. Andie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. This is so awesome to see how this works behind the scenes. I've been listening to you guys for a while, so thank you for having me.
Well, we are thrilled to have you on the show. Sister is beaming.
I am. I found you through the Soil Food Web, and I was like, no one is composting around here.
Right.
Doing BioComplete compost.
Yeah.
And I searched and found you, and we connected, and we've been emailed back and forth a little bit. And then we met a few months ago at Troy Swift's pecan.
Magical day at Troy Swift's.
Oh my gosh, it was fantastic. It rained. The weather was beautiful. It was fantastic. And I really loved, I'm just teasing the Johnson Sioux here because that thrilled me to no end. But it was just great. And it's so great to have you. I'm really happy to have you in this area and doing what you're doing. And thank you, Joanna, for just giving us all her credentials so that you all know who this person is and what she's done. And so now my very first question for you, Andie, is if there were no barriers, if the world turned in an instant and we stopped poisoning everything and we started doing the work that we're doing, how long would it take to see a huge impact?
Oh, gosh. I mean, there are scientists who are actually studying that and would have like a more scientific answer for you. But I imagine within a season, within a year, like we would be experiencing some very real changes in our day-to-day existence, our climate.
Yes.
Yeah, especially rainfall. My goodness. The water cycle would essentially, the small water cycle specifically, which is, the local water cycle to any one person would be restored, and we would feel the effects of that pretty immediately.
Thank you. This is what I know.
Yeah.
She says mic drop.
I mean, seriously, we're done here. There's nothing else. But I'm so excited. And I was thinking of this earlier. Before we do anything else, now we can talk about everything we want to talk about, but in one season. So can we drop climate change and just recognize that this is big money in the wrong places that isn't helping anyone? And if we literally turned that off today, this time next year, we would live in a totally different world.
Absolutely.
And it's not individuals. It's not your neighbor. It's not the town over. This is huge corporations making a ton of money off poisoning our land and our people, our animals. So the solution is here. The time is now.
Yes.
Right now.
Yes.
And I am on fire because this is the right time, the right place, the right people. It is fantastic. And I am so proud. And I knew you were going to give me that answer. I could just freely let you answer that because you have more experience than I do. You have been out on the land. This is my theoretical knowledge. This is what rang deeply inside my body when I heard this, when I read this information, when I've listened to lectures from Dr. Elaine Ingham, like my knowing that this is the solution.
Right.
So then all this hand wringing and running around and pointing fingers is like we're all pointing fingers in the wrong direction. It's straight up. That's where the money is.
Right.
So thanks, Gal. You just made my day. I knew you would.
Happy to. And, I think it's important to realize that economically it's a solution too. I think if we were to restore all of the farmland tomorrow, like your hypothetical situation, it would be profitable.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So it's important to realize
it would
that.
be profitable for the small people,
right,
for the small
right.
farmers, for the individual, for the citizen.
Yeah.
And
big business can play a role in it. Maybe not the same,
Yes.
definitely not the same one that they're playing right now, but there's a place for everyone here in the solution for sure.
Absolutely.
Well, and it would be a lot less pushing global food and more of pushing regional, local
Absolutely.
food systems.
Yeah.
Yesterday, we released a Soil Sisters podcast that we recorded with Fallen Oak Mycology. And we are working on a fun project with them that I will talk to you more about in a bit.
Okay.
But I would love to layer on that conversation because with them, we were talking about the role of both hemp and mushrooms in soil remediation and how they can partner together for soil health. But since you have the expertise that you do, I thought it would be fun to layer on top of that with what mushrooms' role in soil health is. I saw that you had done something on Substack around that, and I just thought, beautiful. Let's get your input.
Yeah, and what inspired the Substack post was a lot of my neighbors asking about the mushrooms that they were seeing earlier this year when we had a lot of rainfall. I mean, we were seeing unprecedented numbers of mushrooms in the dog park, in the yards, and the public spaces, and people were worried about it. And so I took the time to write a post and circulate it with some of my neighbors. But the mushrooms in particular tend to be associated with saprophytic fungi, which are responsible for breaking down carbon-based materials like leaves and wood chips and other sources of organic matter. And recycling that, the fungi is the body of the organism underground, and the mushroom is just the reproductive part above ground that's spreading spores. And so the fungi is always there. We're only seeing the mushrooms when the conditions are optimal for the fungi to go to the effort and, give all that energy to reproduction. So in terms of their role in the soil food web, they're contributing to certain mineral availability to plants, especially in the case of mycorrhizal associations. That would be different from a saprophytic fungi. Saprophytes get all of their carbon from a carbon source. They're breaking down carbon-based materials, whereas mycorrhizae is getting most of their energy directly from the plant. They're entirely reliant on the plant. And so they have a very obligatory agreement where you give me this and I'll go find you phosphorus. You give me sugars is what the mycorrhizal fungi is saying to a plant, and the plant is saying, okay, I'll give you sugars as long as you go get me typically phosphorus, but any number of other minerals as well.
Yes.
And phosphorus is the father of all minerals.
That's right. And the root can't move to the phosphorus. So
Right.
this is nature's beautiful symbiotic way of getting that to the plant through these mycorrhizal fungi.
Yeah, when you look at them under the microscope too, these filaments, the hyphae that make up the mycelium, you realize just how high surface area they are. And that's really why they're the carbon superhero of the underground, is because they're just miles worth of filaments in, I don't know, maybe a couple square feet. Like you could have miles worth of carbon. Basically their filaments are made up of carbon almost entirely. So it's a very stable, that's what gives that hyphae, the mycelium, a very stable structure, is that it's carbon based. So they're not releasing, they still respire like you and I do, right? Like they actually take in oxygen or release CO2, which means they require oxygen in the soil. That's why compaction can be so troubling, is because it reduces the amount of life that can live in there. Right. But they're doing that at a rate that's much lower than, say, if that soil was entirely bacteria dominant rather than having the fungi in there. So when we till the land, a lot of times we're breaking up that mycelium and then it's being consumed by bacteria. You're essentially having a bacterial bloom. You just can't see it, kind of like these algal blooms in the Gulf or wherever. You can see that. It's very visceral, but when we till land, these blooms are very real. You just can't see it unless you were to actually measure the CO2 respiration. And so that's releasing CO2 into the atmosphere. That's the opposite way we want carbon going. We want, instead, for the carbon to be coming from the atmosphere through the plant via photosynthesis and then being produced as sugars or root exudates, which they then feed to the biology underground. And they're constantly using it in their own bodies or preying on each other and cycling nutrients. We just want it to be a common stop in the carbon cycle, the root zone.
You're right. Soil is sexy.
It is sexy. We're already talking about reproduction.
Exactly.
So whenever we are having this conversation, I want to make sure we keep everybody in their cars and online engaged. You teach this stuff. So what are the practical things that you want us to know that people should know so that they can be responsible stewards and gardeners and farmers?
Right. Well, I think there might be some kind of new information. The easy answer would be to take you through the soil health principles, which I think most people know: to keep the ground covered, try to keep a living root there, minimize disturbance, these sorts of things. But I think what might actually be new information that could really help people think differently about soil is to regard it as an ecosystem. So an analogy that I like to use a lot is, if I were a field biologist and I was hired, say, in Yellowstone, and my job was to assess the health of the ecosystem in that region, I would likely be counting predators like wolves and bears, and I'd be counting prey like elk, and I'd be probably counting the vegetation as well, like all the different species in that ecosystem, and so that I can interpret the predator-prey relationships. And I use Yellowstone as an example because, we know what the effects were when the wolves were wiped out. The prey populations grew, to significant numbers, which then decimated certain vegetation, which not only reduced food for other species, but it also reduced habitat for a lot of other species. So there are these cascading effects of when you lost the predators in that ecosystem, you had this these detrimental effects across many other organism groups. And the same thing is true below ground. It's just happening at this microscopic level. And so that's essentially what I'm doing with the microscope is I'm counting the predators and I'm counting the prey. And guess what? In a lot of cases, there are no predators.
Yeah.
And it's a huge problem because we rely on the predators to consume prey in the soil. And that right there, that relationship is what cycles nutrients to plants.
Yes.
So an example of a predator would be, let's say, a bacterial feeding nematode. I went to Texas A&M. I am a proud Aggie, but they only taught me about root feeding nematodes when I went there. Okay. A pathogenic organism. There are so many other types of nematodes, and most of them are beneficial. Okay. So a bacterial feeding nematode does just that, feeds on bacteria, and it takes the nutrients it needs from that microbe, and then it excretes what it doesn't need, and that there is a soluble nutrient. It's a plant available, water soluble nutrient, and that is how nature has fed itself, how plants have always gotten the nutrients they needed without man-made fertilizers for millennia.
From the beginning of time.
Right.
So to get our predator-prey ratio in order, what do we do?
Yeah. Like, the question that I found myself asking pretty early on when I started looking at soils across different contexts was, where are the predators? Why aren't they there? And I have a few theories on this. I think there's certain obvious disturbances that would, kill off predators. So heavy chemical usage being one of them, heavy tillage being another. But it's also a loss of habitat. So it's not just directly harming the biology through your methods of stewardship. It could potentially be that you're reducing the organic matter or ruining soil structure over time, and there's not enough micro aggregates, and aggregation is essentially the homes and hotels and hostels for these microbes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so then,
compaction.
Yes.
And so then they have no homes. There's no oxygen there. There's no place to live. And that does come with all the tilling and the overuse of pesticides and herbicides and such. What have you found to be your best tool for combating compaction?
It is so context dependent, which is looping in another one of the 6 soil health principles. Context is super important in how we address any problem on the land. And so how we would cure compaction in turf management is going to look really different than how we address compaction in agriculture or ranching, even, right? So I'll take, I guess, just one example to kind of provide. I like to take guidance from how nature would typically address compaction, right? So if you think about the best example being the North American bison, right? And how they moved across land. And my understanding is that they have certain structures on their hooves that actually lightly aerate the soil as they go. Now, of course, if you were to leave livestock on land too long, they would cause compaction.
Right. Yes.
But in the right amount,
right, exactly,
managing them in a holistic management type of way, they can actually improve soil structure, not only through the movement of their hooves, bison especially. My understanding is that not all livestock will have like that specific kind of structure, but nonetheless, all livestock can really help with improving soil structure. And it's not just through their hoof impact, but it's through their deposit of their manure, which is a source of organic matter. And it's also inoculating soils, which is super cool. But this is where I, have to get inspiration from, because I'm often working with people who aren't integrating livestock really directly in their lands. So I'm thinking, how can we take what animals do and use compost, or maybe use a certain type of tilling, but like a plow, like to break ground, but using that very intentionally. I just watched a YouTube video from no-till growers, and I just wanted to share this term real quick with y'all, because the guest that they had on said, it's not no-till like N-O, it's no, K-N-O-W till.
Yes.
And I
like it.
loved that.
Yeah.
I've been using IntelliTilling.
IntelliTill. That's cool.
In one of my conversations with Fred Schrank, one of our favorite state agronomists,
Cool.
we were talking about intelligent tilling and saying it over and over again. And we started saying IntelliTilling because it'll be a little catchier in our grant submission that I'm going to be asking you about.
Which we'll talk more about right after this underwriting announcement.
So I'm not sure if I want to continue this conversation with what you're doing, in more urban areas or when you're having to figure out what to do when livestock isn't an option, or the grant conversation. Sister, you tell me which one we need to go to first.
Because when I ask you about compaction, I'm literally thinking about everyone around here who has this heavy clay soil. And so what you were about to say, because they're not going to have animals, although I have an idea for a local grazing
Grazing co-op.
Yes. So anyway, we'll have to discuss this later. But yeah, like just for the home gardener, because the people around here who are listening they're like looking at their grass and this hard soil and like, what do you do about that?
Yeah. Well, on a gardening scale, I think a broad fork can be really useful to initially create some openings in the soil, and then coming in with a high quality biologically active compost.
Yes.
So that to get it down in those grooves, when you introduce the biology, they're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in the future. So you won't necessarily need to be broad forking your soil forever,
Right.
but maybe in the early stages of establishing a garden, it can be a useful tool. And I mean, you could even use a garden fork if you're not interested in investing in a broad fork. There's also ways to even just use like a turf aeration tool that you step on. So there's a lot of, affordable options. That the idea is that you just want to get the biology in there.
Yeah.
And so you can also do soil drenches with a compost extract. So that would be where you take a really biologically active compost, which you can make at home very easily. And you can you can massage it into some water, and you've effectively made a compost extract, and then you drench the soil. And so again, you're getting that biology in there. The last tool that I'll mention is if you're to broad fork or some other way make aeration into the soil, you can incorporate an element of biochar. I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole.
Oh, I am 1,000 times about biochar.
Yeah,
I love the little apartments.
You get biochar that's already been charged or already been added to a compost, and then you mix it with your compost and add it in there. And that's essentially providing a substrate upon which the microbes can form their aggregates.
Yeah.
So it's the foundation for the condos and the soil.
Yes, it's the foundation. It's a very good way to think of it.
Okay, I dig it.
I love that.
Okay, so we were talking about the, principles to manage soil health earlier. So there's 4 that the NRCS and a lot of their programs that they build things around. Maximize presence of living roots, minimize disturbance, maximize soil cover, and maximize biodiversity. So we are working on an on-farm trial that will honor those 4 soil health principles while also introducing a new conservation practice standard that we want NRCS to consider, and that is priming the soil biology for soil health. And we're looking for a way, how can we create a blueprint for growing industrial hemp in Texas, in this region, while also remediating our soil and building our soil health. And so do an on-farm trial that will take both of those things into consideration. So during a meeting with Fred to go over everything, he just said, you have to get Andie Marsh involved in this.
That is so cool. What?
Yes.
And of course, Tim Ald is one of the farmers here in town that we adore and collaborate with, and he's going to be a part of this. And he too said, you have to have Andie Marsh involved.
Oh, wow.
Which you were one of the first names on the list in the very beginning. Fred was at Troy Swift's that day.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, this is my first time to finally get to meet you, but your name and reputation precedes you.
Yay.
Same.
So, yeah, we're talking about, like, as we do this and as we get this on-farm trial going, you know, right now we're in this stage of building out the experiment. What does it look like? Mm-hmm. You know, what are we testing? How are we testing? When? My question for you is, you know, when we're starting something like this and we're trying to capture as much data as possible, the typical AgriLife soil test is not going to cut it. It doesn't tell us near enough. So what all soil testing would you recommend for something like this?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. I think there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. And, you know, a lot of times testing for any experiment boils down to what the budget allows, right? Because I always tell people you can scale this up or you can scale it down, but like here's where I would start. Like how many samples, how many replicates of the trial, if you can even do that, you know. So there's a lot to consider there. But in terms of the types of testing that are available to determine what kind of soil life activity you have going on, obviously, I'm biased to say that like my preferred way is using the microscope because it's the most direct method of measurement. It's as close as we can get to putting our eyeballs under soil, right, and looking around and seeing what's going on. But there are some other ways to measure soil life, and I'll just name those real quick. So there's PLFA, phospholipid fatty acid assay, basically. And so that's an interpretation of the certain cell structures, and then they're determining what type of organism that may or may not be and giving you a report. And then you have the Haney test that is really useful for understanding what types of nutrients could be bioavailable. So a lot of the chemistry testing from our traditional labs will subject a sample to certain chemicals, certain solvents, essentially, and see what nutrients are available in that soil, but they're not accounting for the fact that a lot of the biology have the ability to produce organic acids, which are what essentially mine nutrients from minerals, and that's what the Haney test has been developed to try to address, is account for that.
Okay. Yeah. So we do have, those are on the list, so yay, exciting.
Yay.
Now,
and we'll definitely need someone looking at our biology.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that's the whole point of this is we're building it out and creating the budget. And so as far as I'm concerned, we do all of those tests.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And worth mentioning, genomics testing has come a long way and is becoming really useful in agriculture. It's still the most expensive route to go. So the ones that I mentioned, I prioritize because they're more affordable.
Right.
But yeah, genomics is a very in-depth way of evaluating what's living in the soil.
So what would a genomics test run you? Like how much does one of those cost?
I'd say on average, like $200 to $300 a sample.
Wow.
Yeah, it could be behind in my understanding of how much. It could be cheaper now, but that's my understanding.
And how many samples? Well, like for...
In this particular structure that we're doing, we're going to have 3 plots. So we'd have a 0 plot, a fertilized plot, and a natural fertility plot. So we would need 3 tests per time per farm. We want one when we start. We'll want one, I assume, twice a year after that, after we cover crop and then after the cash crop.
Right. Yeah, I would think those are the milestones, the natural milestones in your timeline. Yeah.
So fun.
Yeah.
And one of the other pieces, too, is this idea of on our fertilized plot, just treating that plot according to the regular traditional Texas A&M soil test that everybody takes, and then the natural fertility plot, hopefully treating it with the silica prebiotic and the mushroom substrate, and then our Johnson Sioux.
Oh, cool. Yeah, that'll be rocking and rolling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very exciting.
And then, of course, in our Johnson Sioux, having algae, being included in that the high level basics.
That's right.
You know, we're like, okay, yes, that's what that soil test says, but we're just doing these natural high level basics that all soil needs. How,
Right.
what happens?
Right. I got an algae gal for you if you need one.
Okay.
All right.
I wonder if it's the same algae, folks. But yes, it's for the Conservation Innovation Grant. So working on the submission now, we would submit it in the spring, get funded in the fall, and start this time next year, a little earlier,
Right.
but doing, the initial testing on all of the plots and planting the cool season cover crop and starting. So
Cool.
we've given you a 1 year notice.
Yes,
Would
I
you
love-
like to join our team?
Yeah, I'm feeling great about this.
Yay.
Love a year notice.
Isn't that fantastic?
Yes. You don't have to pencil you in. You can
Right.
actually write this one in there.
Yeah.
All right, sister, I've been hogging the conversation. I know you have things that were front burner conversations for you. And
Well, because I know the soil food web version of compost, you said there's an easy way. I want to talk about that. And then also some of your findings about the Johnson Sioux. But let's go ahead and start with the compost. What's our easy way
Yeah.
to make compost at home?
Well, I think we can talk about both of them at the same time because
Perfect.
Johnson Sioux Bioreactor is one of the best ways, easiest ways to make a biodiverse compost. And you can do all of the hardcore thermophilic, meet your heat cycles, turn it, some people, that's of interest to them to have a spreadsheet. I always say if it's in your personality, like follow
your heart.
Follow your heart. But for most of us, we're so busy cultivating that we need something that can just kind of be going on in the background with minimal effort. And a Johnson Sioux is a beautiful way to do that because you have just one, I don't know, maybe 3-hour workday where you're procuring all your materials, wetting them down and filling a cylinder. And then from then on, you just keep it properly moist and it'll be ready for you. You'll have the best compost in town, like 10 to 12 months from then. So we can talk in more detail about Johnson Sioux, but I'd also give Vermi-Compost a shout out as like a pretty useful and low maintenance way of making a really biodiverse compost. The trick with that one, Vermi-Compost is, more of an ongoing, it's less of a static. It's still a static compost in that, like, you're not turning it,
Right.
but you do need to be actively feeding it to keep
Yeah.
the microbial communities active. Where at Johnson Sioux, it's not that way. It's more of a set it and leave it. So Vermi-Compost, I think, can be a really great activity for home gardeners, especially because you always have food scraps and you need something to do with them. I mean, I love a good backyard compost heap too.
Yeah.
And you can make really biodiverse. So those would be the three: a Johnson Sioux bioreactor, which is more set it and leave it; a Vermi-Compost bin, which is really interactive. It becomes a practice, which I think can have great effects on us as stewards. And then the last one being more of an open pile that's just a good old-fashioned heap on the ground, but you're managing it in a way that's really stewarding a thriving microbiome.
Well, you are just knocking it out of the park today, Andie. Like, seriously, because this is where I have come. Like, everything that you're saying is where, because the whole Johnson Sioux and being out at Troy Swift's place, I was just like,
Yeah.
yes, please,
Yes.
and thank you. And then to hear the numbers of the different microbes
Oh, yeah.
and what's going on there, I was just like, and that was straight pecan wood, just chipped wood. And it wasn't like green and brown and 40% of this and 30% of that. It just like, this is what it is. And you just keep it watered and it's beautiful, which I just love because I think that's nature's story to us
Of
is like,
course.
keep it simple.
Yes.
Like, it doesn't have to be so complicated. I mean, there's plenty of things that are complicated, but there's like basically like the systems are like this eats that, and then here's our nutrients.
Yes.
And, that's the way it is for a lot of things.
Right. Like human health too. Like it
Yes.
doesn't have to be that complicated.
Exactly.
Sleep well, eat well.
Yes. Yes.
Exercise. Yeah.
So did you help Troy Swift get his operation started?
He had already started it. So the timing was kind of interesting when Troy reached out. I had just looked at my first sample of someone else's Johnson Sioux compost, and I say it blew my hair back how much fungi I saw in there. I was like, holy smokes, I've looked at a lot of compost, and most of it, especially unfortunately, and it doesn't have to be this way, but from a lot of industrial sources, it's just a lot of bacteria. And we've been talking about how part of our problem is that we don't have a lot of diversity in our soils, and we want to improve that. And yet we're putting loads of compost down. And if it doesn't have the diversity, then we're just kind of perpetuating the problem, right? I liken this to if you had a mouse problem and your solution was to go to a pet store, buy a bunch of mice, and then release them in the house. Like, that's kind of what we're doing with our soils. So, yes, to answer your question with Troy Swift, he had already made like 6 different recipes of Johnson Su. They're a mix of different inputs, but mostly carbon-based. So he has a pecan orchard, so it was a mix of like pecan shells in one mixed with wood chips, or all wood chips, or all pecan shells, or I think one of them had some spent beer grain in it. And I looked at all 6 of them, did the count. I counted the organisms we see, and then I provided a report so it was really clear which one was moving him to where he wanted to be as quickly as possible. And that ultimately ended up being the one with pure wood chips.
Wood chips. I was just like,
Wow.
Yeah, it's easy peasy.
Yes.
You know, everyone can get, typically you can get wood chips. This is also true if you just fill it with a bunch of brown leaves. Mm-hmm. So this is a great time of year to be talking about this. If you're like me, I don't have a ton of trees, unfortunately, that are big enough to like really make a whole Johnson Su right on my own property. But I will go around and pick up bags of people's leaves that they're leaving at the curb and fill my Johnson Su with them.
I love that. I have a friend who's like, Crystal, do you need more leaves? And I was like, absolutely. So I've got like 9 bags, and I kept telling her, you need to put them on your yard. She was like, I already have. This is more. And I'm like, okay, so as long as I'm not taking food from your lawn. But yeah, I got like 9 of those big bags.
Yeah.
It was fantastic.
Yeah.
So for someone building one of these at home, what is the size of the vessel that we're using?
So there's actually a modified design. I've written about this on my Substack. So if you're having a hard time envisioning it, there's photos there. But it's basically a hardware cloth that's in the form of a cylinder, and you want it up off the ground, so on a pallet. And it's essential that it's on a pallet because that helps keep the whole cylinder well aerated. And as we talked about already, these fungi that we're trying to raise, they're aerobic, so they need access to oxygen. And you can put a really simple way to do this to make sure the center stays aerated is to put a smaller cylinder on the inside that doesn't have anything put in it. So you basically make a donut, right? A donut shape. Okay. So it has a hole in the center. And then you fill that ring that you created with leaves or wood chips. And the way that I prefer doing this is I'll have totes out or buckets, and I put the leaves in the tote, and then I hose them down, or use, especially if you're catching rainwater, that's like awesome. You can just soak them overnight even, and then you come out. You really can't overwater a Johnson Su, especially when you're building it the first day, because it'll drain really well. Right. And then the trick is maintaining moisture. So whether you're checking on it a couple times a week to add water, or what Troy did is automated irrigation. He just set up irrigation to it, and that was chef's kiss.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
I literally was doing that. Like, brilliant, man.
Yeah. Because then you just check to make sure things are working every now and then, but it takes care of the watering for you, and it'll be ready sooner.
Man.
Yeah, I do want to go look at your Substack to see it. I've seen other people's, but I want to see how you specifically did it, because it wasn't the rounded donut shape. They had, it was more like
they had little chimneys in
yeah.
there.
Yeah. That way is, it's fantastic. It obviously works great, but I find this way is just easier to install for most people.
That's why I'm like, I want to see this one.
I'm about that. I love a good Johnson Su step-by-step with pictures. Right? That's great. That is great.
And the one thing to note about Johnson Su is that it's not going to take care of your food scraps, right? But it's one of these things that you build it, like I said, you build it in a day, set it and leave it, let it do its thing. And in the meantime, you can be composting your food scraps in a different way. And that is also going to be a good source of microbes for you.
And then at the end, when our compost is ready, we can make a tea.
Yes.
An extract, actually.
Yeah, an extract.
I'm not a tea person
Same.
either. Too much.
Same.
As the moment you start growing the bacteria for the environment, I'm like, we've lost our diversity.
Right.
So I'm like, extract all the way.
Right. So, and for the people, if you don't mind, Chris, I'll just explain real quick what a tea and an extract.
Yes.
But a tea, a lot of people are trying to brew. They put little air stones in a bucket and they're trying to brew. They're adding seaweed extract and fish hydrolysate and maybe molasses. And what ends up happening, and I only know this from having a microscope practice, is that people actually end up inevitably raising a lot of bacteria and kind of incidentally killing off a lot of their beneficial diversity. Right. And so it's just a heck of a lot easier to make an extract, which you're just trying to knock the microbes off of the compost and into water. That's all you're trying to do with an extract, and then you use it immediately. So you don't have to worry about a brew time or a shelf life or how many teaspoons of what to put in there. You can still add those organic fertilizers, essentially, the seaweed and all that, to your extract at the time that you're applying it. But yeah, just so much easier.
Yes.
Okay, so you saying all of that, whenever I mentioned the algae. So we make our Johnson Sioux, and then at the end, we put all of our things together before we apply it.
Yeah, I love that.
Now, what about things that people struggle with, like an overabundance of Johnson grass, or they have a lot of stickers? We had discussed making a ferment of those things. How would you apply that, or what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I like the idea of doing a ferment, and it's for the same reasons that what I do with weeds is I will go to the effort of doing a thermophilic compost with them. So I use them as green materials in a compost that I'm going to make sure it gets up to temperature to kill off weed seeds, to kill off pathogens and other things. But what's cool about either one of those options is that those plants are growing on the land for a reason. Like, the land needs something from them. And so if your tactic is to just cut them down and dispose in some way of the biomass, I think it can just be so much better to use the biomass and return it to the land in some way. Yes. So those are two different ways that you could do that. Yeah.
And we've come full circle with that, like from worrying about having to get rid of it, because that's just a whole can of worms that I'm not trying to open. Getting rid of something, we're managing for what we want.
Right.
So learning that the sticker burr seeds can't germinate if there's humic acid in the soil was a real
cool,
ding. Like, here, okay, thank you. So now I know, because putting more carbon in the soil, more organic material, like, I've known that's what needs to happen. And
right.
So
that makes a lot of sense, because if you think about, and this is from the Soil Food Web teachings, is the fungi to bacteria ratio, and knowing that tree landscapes prefer much more fungi than bacteria, but weeds tend to thrive in bacteria dominance, very low fungi. And most of our plants that we're trying to grow in agriculture are going to be somewhere in that kind of 1-to-1 range, a balance between the two. When you said humic acid prevents germination, fungi naturally produce humic acid. And so you're essentially kind of mimicking a higher fungi to bacteria ratio to suppress the bacteria dominant plant species.
Yeah. Love it.
Well, and the other thought is, because we are currently budgeting for all of these things, and it's nice to know that you have options based on what your budget is.
Right.
Right. And using humic acid is like a tool until you get your fungal values up, and then you won't have to do that, because the fungi is going to be generating it for you.
Well, and the thing is, we have 30 acres of land on our family's ranch that has been commercially, or not commercially, but regular farmed like everyone else.
Conventional,
Conventional. So we're just like rehab. Like, how can we support you and just put some stuff in here to kickstart what we're going for. Now, one of the questions that I wanted to ask was for a 30-acre piece of land, because in my mind, I know that Johnson Sioux liquid is going to be, for me, that's what I feel like is best. As long as we have some organic material getting in the soil, that would be my biggest bang for my buck. What do you know about equipment that you would use to apply that?
This is definitely an area that I'm currently focused on growing my knowledge and experience in, is equipment. And in fact, I've actually asked Troy. We've talked about Troy so much. Yes. God bless Troy.
He's next.
Yeah. I've asked him if I can maybe come down, trade him some Microscope services for learning more about like his pumps and even get behind the wheel of, some of the equipment, because he's doing this, he's applying. So I know he would have some like actual concrete answers for you. I've been on site with certain liquid applications, soil drenches, and it essentially looks like, honestly, it looks the same as like an herbicide truck, which is kind of useful because people already have this equipment.
Yes.
And we just need to make sure it's clean enough to not harm biology, but you could essentially reuse it in a lot of cases. Yeah. And another useful thing with the microscope is just helping people. I often ask people to take a sample of their compost liquid, in the batch that they made it in, then give me a sample of it on the other end of the sprayer as it's coming out. To make sure that your biology is surviving the trip.
Not squishing them all.
Yeah, through the sprayer and the plumbing. And occasionally I'll just see like a load of lactobacillus, which just indicates that there's a biofilm buildup in the plumbing. So yeah, cleanliness is a huge part of cleaning up your equipment so that you're not generating biofilms that are going to hinder the beneficial biology that you're raising is really important.
Good information.
Yeah.
So when we collect these samples for you, what is the best way for us to handle them, store them, to get them to use so that we're not disturbing the biology?
Yeah. The fact that you're asking that question is really thoughtful. A lot of people will take a sample and then freeze it or refrigerate it. And then I have to tell them, I'm sorry, you're going to have to go back out. So yeah, you want to just keep it as close to in situ conditions as possible. And that's just a scientific word for like the context in which you collected it. So keeping that sample at ambient temperatures before getting it to the lab, and getting it to the lab as quickly as possible. So with y'all being local, that's going to be super easy. But for some people that I work with across the country, they're having to like overnight stuff to me. And you collect the sample about in the top 4 inches of the soil. That's where most of the soil life is occurring and doing their thing. And that's where we tend to interpret their numbers. It doesn't mean that they're not also at deeper levels in the soil. That's just protocol for assessing soil life. And yeah, you want to take a representative sample. So what that might mean for your experiment is looking at the land and making sure that your different treatments, you're collecting kind of a random subsample, like that 4-inch core, and putting it into a bag and then mixing them. And that's like one representative sample for that one treatment, and then moving on to the next one.
Okay.
I learned this in my school. I just wasn't good enough to go through that technical part.
Oh, yeah, right. It's not for everyone, that's for sure.
I love what I know, and I can look at a sample and I can see
there you go. Yeah.
There's this, there's that, there's not. I've never seen a springtail. Your post the other day made me so happy. I've seen some really cool bacterial feeders and things like that, but not any of the interesting little springtails or... Yeah,
compost is what you need to be looking at under a microscope. That's where all the life is. It's a little incubator of life, those compost piles. And I'm really passionate about just teaching people how to use a microscope for doing exactly what you just described, because you don't need to have it so well down that in order to count them and identify them like I do, to know a lot about your soil by just knowing the basics of how to run a microscope. You can be like, is there diversity or is there not?
Exactly.
Is there more than there was last season or not?
Well, I am totally interested in hanging out and looking at microscope stuff with you. So if you do a class, then let me know, because
I will.
That's one thing. I'm old enough to need human contact and interaction through learning.
Yeah, especially with a microscope.
Yeah, just like, look at this. What do you see?
Yeah. So it's tough online to gather all of that, those little tips and tricks. So yeah, I do plan to hold in-person events next year for that.
Perfect. Well, I will be your first sign up.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
So when you're looking at the microbiology under your microscope, how are you extrapolating how much is in our 30-acre field? Like, how does... What do you do?
So that is, all of these different testing methods all have their own limitations, and that's definitely one of them for the microscope, is we're taking essentially a gram of soil and then a drop of soil and then counting the organisms in that. And I might look at a few different prepared slides to really make sure that the story is more or less the same between all of them. And that's really what it comes down to, is a story. Like who's there, in what numbers, are their populations considered stable or unstable, and what does that mean for our soil health? It really is an estimate of microbes per gram, right? Because I'm not actually counting all the microbes per gram. I'm counting all the microbes in a drop, essentially. And then we're, having to do math to make that an estimate per gram. And then we're taking that and then applying it to the amount of grams of soil across your 30 acres, which this is a big math equation. But again, the story is often the same, whether I look at the soil at point A, point B to point Z in that field. It's rarely going to be like wildly different, assuming that the conditions are pretty similar.
It's interesting that you call it a story, because you are looking under a microscope at a tiny little community, and what are the problems within the community? What's growing? What's not? What do they need? I mean, it's just practical to everyday life.
Definitely.
All right. Well, this has been so good. What else is there?
Well, since we just have a couple of minutes left, you talked about the broad fork or something like that. Are there a couple of tools that you think we should all have in our lineup?
I think you need a bucket.
This is what I'm talking about. Keep going.
And you need a mesh bag of some kind. And that is all you need to make your compost extract. And that's going to do a lot of heavy lifting for you. So, as far as trying to go out and find the best inoculant, like there's a whole industry of biostimulant products. And I'm not saying that they're not useful, but your compost at home, that's free to make, can be really useful if you have a bucket and a mesh bag.
I dig it.
I
keep it simple, stupid.
This is what I'm talking about.
So the mesh bag, is there a certain, like
micron size or something? There is. I don't know it off the top of my head. The one that I purchased is from a company called T-Lab, and they specialize in that kind of thing. And also I've confirmed its usefulness, again, using the microscope, super helpful. So I've heard of people using, I think you could use cheesecloth. And that opening size would be just as good. Yeah.
Perfect.
So you might not even need to go out and buy anything.
There you go.
I love a low-tech option.
I do too. I do too.
Well, we will definitely have to have you here again with us. We'll just continue the conversation on the Soil Sisters podcast, where we don't have a time limit on it and we can get super nerdy. But I love that you are in for the Soil Sisters Conservation Innovation Grant.
Oh, yeah.
I think these on-farm trials are going to be so valuable for not only us, the farmers that are participating, but then also just giving something new to the NRCS to consider.
Yeah, to consider, right.
Well, and that it's so important. It is so important. I have not ever been, whatever. I used to speak up a lot when I was saying who knows what when I was younger. But the older that I get, the quieter that I get. And I'm like, this is important. We have to talk about this.
Yeah.
So it means everything to me that you're here doing what you're doing, that you came to hang out with us, that we're going to collaborate in even bigger ways with more people in this community, and it's really exciting. So thank you so much for taking the time to come here and be with us.
Thanks for what you're doing.
And if you ever get a wild hair and want to make a trip with us to West Texas and come out to J.D. Patterson Ranch, we would love to
That'd be cool.
have you show you what we're doing and share what our vision is. And
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's about 5 hours from here. We'll have a little road trip. It'll be great.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I'll drive. I get there fast.
We definitely need to do that.
Okay,
Sign me
good.
up.
Connect with the Soil Sisters at txsoilsisters.co. Submit questions, guest or show ideas, and sponsorship inquiries. The Soil Sisters podcast was created and produced by Joanna Nuding. Editing and sound design are in the capable hands of the PodConnects Podcast Network.